Welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're going to be diving into a truly intense biographical piece by William Douglas called Deep Water. Now, right off the bat, I want to say that this isn't just a story about learning how to swim. It's actually a profound look into the human psyche, how terror takes root in our minds, and exactly what it takes to completely conquer it. So let me ask you this. Have you ever been completely, utterly paralyzed by fear? And I don't just mean a brief startle or a jump scare. I mean that suffocating feeling of absolute panic, where you feel entirely helpless, trapped, and your body literally stops responding. Well, that is the exact nightmare William Douglas lived through, and his journey to overcome that deep water is exactly what we're mapping out today.
All right, let's start with part one, the roots of fear. You know, massive phobias rarely just pop out of nowhere, right? They usually grow from deeply buried memories. For Douglas, it wasn't just a single event, but more like a compound fracture of his confidence. It all starts at age 3 or 4. He's at a California beach with his dad, and a wave completely sweeps him above the water. He's rescued, sure, but the seed of fear is planted. Fast forward to age 10 or 11, he decides, okay, I'm going to conquer this and learn to swim at the local YMCA pool. Why? Because it seemed perfectly safe. It was shallow at one end and only about 9 feet at the other. But ironically, that seemingly safe pool becomes the site of his absolute worst nightmare. One day, while he's just sitting there alone, a much bigger boy simply picks him up and tosses him straight into the deep end.
Which brings us to part two, trapped in the deep. Literally, in a fraction of a second, Douglas goes from being a relatively confident kid to fighting for his actual survival. He hits the water and sinks helplessly straight to the bottom, utterly terrified. But his brain is still working. He forms a desperate plan. Hit the bottom, push up hard, and reach the edge. He desperately tries to jump up to the surface, but he fails. He just keeps bobbing up and down, his lungs feeling like they're literally going to burst. Finally, every single attempt to survive fails, and the fear becomes so incredibly overwhelming that he becomes completely paralyzed. And then he starts to lose consciousness. Then everything went black. It's wild, but as he slipped away, he actually describes this strange, eerie calmness washing over him. It was as if all his panic had just suddenly disappeared. He stopped struggling, went completely still, and the darkness just took over. Now for part three, a life paralyzed. Now, Douglas didn't die at the bottom of that pole. He wakes up safely beside the water. But listen, surviving was really just the beginning of this crippling shadow that ended up staying with him for years. Because of that trauma, he entirely avoided swimming, boating, fishing, basically any activity remotely related to water. Even the mere sight of water made him wildly anxious. Massive parts of his joy and his potential were simply stolen by this lingering fear. It dictated his whole life. Let's move on to part four. Step-by-step recovery. Eventually, Douglas hits a profound turning point. He basically says, I absolutely refuse to live in fear forever. So he hires an instructor. But the instructor doesn't just toss him back in the water. They broke the recovery down into these incredibly methodical, bite-sized, manageable steps. First, they practiced with a safety belt and a rope attached, just to make him feel secure. Next, he learned how to actually put his face in the water and control his breathing. Then they carefully broke down specific leg and arm movements. It's like a giant puzzle. And this step-by-step training continued for months until Douglas finally, slowly began getting his confidence back. Which leads us to part five, facing the open water. But here's the thing, mastering the physical mechanics, that wasn't the whole shebang. The psychological ghost of his trauma was definitely still hanging around. To truly overcome it, Douglas first went back to that exact same YMCA pool, swimming across it again and again. But a pool is a controlled environment, right? To truly be free, he knew he had to take his newly learned skills out into uncontrolled, open lakes and rivers. He had to test himself against the real-world unpredictability of nature. And out there in the open water, whenever that old familiar terror tried to sneak back into his mind, he used this incredibly powerful internal anchor. He literally reminded himself, I have learned to swim. I am safe. He used his preparation and all those months of diligent practice to actively push back the panic. He didn't just cross his fingers and hope the fear wouldn't return. He faced it down with the rational truth of his new capabilities. And finally, part six, the power of courage.
Through this relentless, stubborn exposure, Douglas completely conquered his aquaphobia, turning a paralyzing fear into an absolute victory. The core takeaway from his story is actually pretty simple. Fear can be overcome with courage, determination, and continuous effort. Running away from fear only makes it stronger, but facing it step by step makes us stronger. Douglas's story really is a universal blueprint. Avoidance shrinks your world, but breaking your terror down into manageable daily steps, that rebuilds your strength.
So I want to leave you with something to really chew on today. Look at your own life. What deep water are you running away from right now? What is that one fear that is stealing your joy or holding you back? And more importantly, what is the very first small, methodical step you can take today to start swimming through it? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this deep dive has given you some powerful tools to face whatever abyss might be standing in your way. See you next time.